from outside the theater in Moscow. Now more on the death of Senator Wellstone, and for that I turn things over to our own Judy Woodruff. Judy?
Thanks, Anderson. I'm actually reporting tonight from Manchester, New Hampshire. We came to New Hampshire yesterday to cover a tight Senate race here. Things in the state of New Hampshire not very different from so many other states around the country at this time of the year, with the Senate literally, United States Senate literally hanging in the balance. You have candidates rushing from one campaign stop to another, trying to squeeze in as many activities as they can. Senator Paul Wellstone in Minnesota, no different. He was locked in a tight Senate race. But this morning, when he got up and got on a small plane with his wife, his daughter, 3 members of his staff, and the 2 pilots, it wasn't to go to a campaign stop. Our Bill Delaney picks up the story tonight from there.
Senator Paul Wellstone's twin-engine, 11-seat A100 crashed in freezing rain and light snow.
The plane was making an approach into the Evelyn airport when something happened to it. It went down. The area where the plane is at, it would be, when you look out here, it's pretty much what you're looking at. It's a typical wooded area of northeastern Minnesota. The approach to get into the scene is very swampy, it's wet, a lot of pine trees.
A team from the National Transportation Safety Board left Washington to investigate the tragedy. One mystery, why 7 miles out from Evelyn, Virginia Municipal Airport, the King Air aircraft reported no problems, only to crash 2 miles from the airport. Besides the senator, a one-time college professor raised in Virginia, Sheila, his wife and close advisor, also lost. And the Wellstone's daughter, Marcia. 3 campaign staffers and 2 pilots died too. Wellstone leaves 2 sons, 6 grandchildren. He'd been on the flight to northeastern Minnesota to attend a funeral, an interlude amid his hard-fought race for re-election. Tributes for perhaps the Senate's most liberal member came from all sides of the political spectrum.
Paul Wellstone was my closest friend in the Senate. He was the most principled public servant I've ever known. Paul truly had the courage of his convictions, and his convictions were based on the principles of hope and compassion.
We didn't vote very often together, but we respected one another, and he'd come by my desk, and I'd go back and talk to him now and then, joke back and forth. He had this very lively personality, and he's just a good, decent guy.
And a man who, like all politicians, managed to scale heights of power, then to spend endless hours in the air to stay there, flying home, overseas junkets, campaigning. In October 2 years ago, Missouri Governor Mel Carnahan, running for Senate, crashed in bad weather. Running posthumously, he went on to win that seat. In April 1991, Senator John Heinz of Pennsylvania was killed when his plane crashed into a helicopter. In September 1983, Representative Larry McDonald of Georgia was shot down by a Russian MiG on board Korean Air Flight 007. And now, Paul Wellstone. Bill Delaney, CNN, Washington.
In a few minutes, we will delve into the sometimes always interesting, often fascinating, and sometimes unlikely career of Paul Wellstone. We'll talk to friends and colleagues on both sides of the aisle. But first, let's consider the broader political implications, political and otherwise, of his passing. Let's turn to my colleague, Jonathan Karl, who tonight joins us from St. Paul, Minnesota. Jonathan?
Well, Judy, I'm here on the steps of the State House, the Minnesota State House here in St. Paul, where just a little while ago there was a candlelight vigil. It's happened quite spontaneously tonight. Hundreds of people coming out, hundreds of Minnesotans, many Democrats, but not just Democrats, Republicans and independents as well, lighting a candle, singing songs, remembering Paul Wellstone. Here at the grounds, on the grounds of the state capitol, was also the very famous bus, that old bus, the old beat-up bus that Paul Wellstone used when he first ran for Senate back in 1990 and was a staple in all his campaigns. That was here as well. People left flowers and candles on the bus and remembered him. And they weren't just remembering Paul Wellstone here, Judy. Remember, there were 8 people, of course, who died on that plane. There were the 2 pilots, there were Wellstone's family, the 2 pilots, and also those 3 staffers. One of those staffers was Mary McAvoy, who was also the vice chairman of the Democratic Party here in Minnesota. And her daughter was here among those, lighting a candle and singing and remembering and crying and laughing and trying to deal with all this. Her daughter, Rebecca, who was a freshman in high school, and I spoke to her right after this vigil was over. Here's what she said.
They actually let me hold a sign for my mom, and they were chanting Mary, and it just made me feel so special because everyone knew who she was and everyone liked her so much. And it just feels like she should be here right now because it's at a Wellstone thing, and she should be here and screaming Wellstone along with everyone else.
So Judy, as you can see, a very tough story here. Really, Democrats and everybody else in Minnesota in a state of shock, but they also were very well aware that they are 11 days away from an election, and this, as you know, was ground zero in the battle for control of the Senate. This was one of those half-dozen races that was the most hotly contested, and now Democrats are scrambling to figure out what comes next. And as you know, and as you've been reporting, one of the names that we're hearing a lot is Walter Mondale. And what I can tell you about Walter Mondale tonight, I know Patty Murray is going to be on the show later. I've been told by Democrats that Patty Murray, who is, of course, senator from Washington and the chairman of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, has been reaching out, trying to get a hold of Mr. Mondale tonight. We've also been told that labor leaders like John Sweeney of the AFL-CIO will be reaching out to Mr. Mondale over the next 12 hours, trying to ask him to jump in and to take Paul Wellstone's place on the ballot here in Minnesota. The Democrats have until Friday at 4 o'clock. That is their deadline. By Friday at 4 o'clock, they must decide who they are going to put on the ballot to replace Paul Wellstone. Judy?
John Carl, thanks very much. I've been talking to some Democrats as well, all of whom agree that Walter Mondale, if he agreed to do it, would be an immediately well-accepted choice. Senator Mondale, former Senator, former Vice President Mondale, still being a very popular figure in the state of Minnesota. Thank you, John. Well, the praise for Paul Wellstone, as you've been hearing, is coming in from all quarters. And one line that we liked in particular came from someone, I guess you'd have to say is a leading voice in Minnesota, Garrison Keillor, Prairie Home Companion author. He said, quote, "He was delighted by disagreement." That's what Garrison Keillor said about Paul Wellstone, somebody you might enjoy arguing with at a dinner party or on the Senate floor, an old-school liberal out of political fashion these days. But as anyone will tell you, fashion was the last thing that motivated Paul Wellstone. He was all about conviction and about the passion of his beliefs. Here's Candy Crowley.
And there'll be no education reform bill.
He was a gregarious people person who cast many lonely votes. 99-1, 98-2. It's a good bet one of the dissenters was the senator from Minnesota.
Senators voting in the negative: Murray and Wellstone.
Paul Wellstone was intensely passionate, purely liberal. He said drug industry profits were obscene, bankruptcy laws were anti-consumer, and tax policy favored the rich.
Republicans want some of the largest corporations in the country to pay zero in taxes, but they refuse to help the people who are flat on their back, out of work.
He could talk endlessly. A survey of congressional staffers called Wellstone one of the Senate's biggest windbags. Lobbyists dubbed him the worst dressed.
I probably didn't offend anybody by not being in a suit, huh?
No. But Wellstone's uncompromising politics were softened by the playfulness of his character.
We're going to win! That's right.
His life was a culmination of unlikely stories. In 1990, Wellstone, a college professor, took on a powerful incumbent Republican senator. Wellstone had no money, an old green campaign bus, and quirky commercials.
Unlike my opponent, I don't have $6 million, so I'm going to have to talk fast. This is my wife Sheila and our children. This is my house in Northville where I've lived for 21 years. My son David farms, and I've worked with Minnesota.
It was one of the decade's political stunners. Wellstone won, and his political career was launched. This son of Jewish-Russian immigrants eventually became the senior senator from Minnesota, who fought against the big guys for the little guys, the darling of the big burly unions in Minnesota's Iron Range.
The best senator in the United States.
Despite his undiluted liberalism, Wellstone found pockets of bipartisanship. He and conservative Senator Pete Domenici, both with mental illness in the family, teamed up to push for insurance parity for mental illness.
It is a matter of fairness and justice, and we are going to fight this all the way. And
He thought what mattered most was principle, so when Wellstone broke his promise to serve for only 2 terms, he took some heat. But he said the stakes were too high in a divided Senate for him to leave. Like the last 2 races, this one was tight. But Wellstone remained Wellstone, which this fall meant being the only Democrat in a tough race to vote against the resolution of war against Iraq.
I have to only do what my head and heart and soul tell me is the right thing to do.
Though he was battling multiple sclerosis, Wellstone's fight for his seat was energetic and classic Wellstone.
I think the race has to do with, people in Minnesota saying, look, we want a senator who is on our side when it comes to jobs or when it comes to being willing to take on these big economic interests. We don't view Paul as a WorldCom guy or an Enron guy or Global Crossings guy. We view him as one of us and for us.
Paul Wellstone died at the age of 58, eulogized as a decent man of great passion and optimism. I still believe, he once said, that government can be a force for good in people's lives.
There are this evening so many tributes, and as usual, the simplest are the best, said Democratic Senate Leader Tom Daschle. Paul Wellstone was the soul of the Senate. Anderson?
Thanks, Candy. It's actually Judy, and we want you to stay around for a little while because we're going to come back shortly with more on the life and the death of Paul Wellstone. Anderson will also be back a little later on the show with more on the charges against the 2 men who have now been accused of being the snipers in the Washington area. Newsnight continues.
Newsnight with Aaron Brown is brought to you by Canon. With thousands of products and one simple idea, giving people know-how. Canon know-how. And by UPS. What can Brown do for you?
We've been talking about Senator Paul Wellstone, killed tragically today in a plane crash in Minnesota. My colleague Jeff Greenfield, CNN senior analyst, was in Minnesota this week traveling and talking with Senator Wellstone. Jeff is with us now in New York. Jeff.
Judy, on Monday I flew up to Minneapolis. It was snowing. Drove up to St. Cloud and watched Senator Wellstone engage in a 4-way debate in Minnesota. Classic Minnesota politics, contentious debate, issue-oriented and very civil. And when the debate was over, I followed him to a rally at St. Cloud, in St. Cloud, Minnesota, at a college. And then, in front of that famous bus you've been talking about, Senator Wellstone and I did a brief interview. And I want you to see a bit of it because it gives you a flavor of the kind of unpretentious, ask me whatever you want, I'll answer it kind of guy he was. Take a look.
Yeah, I'm not 10 feet tall, but you make me feel 10 feet tall. Together we can win this race, and together we can win this race the right way, on the basis of our hopes and dreams and love for Minnesota. We'll win the race!
Has there been a change in the emphasis that you bring to your job? Has 12 years in Washington, I don't want to say too exactly changed you anything, but
Yeah, it has. Of course 12 years in Washington has changed me, but in this way and not this way. 12 years in Washington has changed me in that I learned after the first year, you need to know the rules and you need to know your leverage and you need to know how to do the work for people in Minnesota. Second of all, you push the envelope all the time, but every time you can get something done for Minnesota, you do it. And that's what I do. I love coming through for communities. Both Sheila and I love doing that. What hasn't changed is same values, same hopes, same dreams, and sometimes the same indignation.
The use of force resolution you voted against, people have actually suggested, well, that actually is proof that you are who you are, even if most people disagree with you, and that you're not suffering from that politically.
I don't actually to this day know ultimately how that vote what will happen, but I'll tell you this. I voted against the resolution. Everybody said it's over in Washington, and I didn't know, but I have no numbers like how many people for against, but I know this. People in Minnesota have been unbelievably gracious and respectful to me. People have been so respectful. They come up, and even when they don't agree, they have been so respectful about that vote. I am blessed. Sound like a real politician, but I am blessed to be a senator from Minnesota.
Is there something about this state that puts you in the Senate?
Well, this state is special. I will love people in Minnesota for the rest of my life for the opportunity they've given me, and I hope they'll give me the opportunity again to be a senator. But personally, I think I could be, with my looks, I could get elected in any state.
I can't top that. All right. Thank you. It's often said, you know, Judy, about people on the left that they love humanity, but they're not too crazy about people. Nobody can say that about Paul Wellstone. He ran a campaign, and he was having the time of his life in his campaign. A close race, he was a few points ahead, but this was a hugger. This was a man who embraced friends, he embraced foes. He was on the campaign trail. He really exemplified what Hubert Humphrey once called in 1968 the politics of joy. That may not have been a good year to talk about that, but Wellstone brought joy to the campaign, and he made everybody have a good time, even the people who were going to vote against him. Judy?
Indeed, Jeff. The word leprechaun came to mind when I saw him. I mean, he was, as we've said today, small in stature, but a big heart full of joy. Candy Crowley is back with us now, as well as Jeff. You know, to Candy, you know, you consider what Paul Wellstone brought. There really is nobody even close to him in terms of his presence and just the package, if you will, in the Senate. And you covered the Senate, Candy.
There isn't, because you have liberals, but there are not those as liberal. But you also have this great combination of a man who really was a liberal and a nice guy, what Jeff just alluded to. I mean, they liked a sense of humor. I mean, you know, you just sort of look at the people tonight at come on. I mean, Jesse Helms, who has nothing in common politically with Paul Wellstone other than their passion for their own separate beliefs, who said tonight, you know, Paul Wellstone was my friend, and, you know, I was his. So he was able to be a real people person and then cast, again, these really lonely votes. I mean, he hardly ever agreed, even with his own party, but he stood on principle. They respected him for that, and they really liked the guy.
Jeff, is it really so rare that we find a politician with principle? I mean, we all seem to be remarking on that today and tonight.
You raise a very good point, Judy. There's an echo of what a lot of us are saying about Paul Wellstone that's pretty damning about how we think of politics as usual. Look, Paul Wellstone, in the two Senate races, never got more than 50.5% of the vote. He won by 2 points in 1990. He won by more in 96 because there was a third-party candidate. If he'd won this time out, he probably would have gotten about 50%. So it's not as though he was beloved in a political sense. You know, a lot of people strongly disagree with him. But the answer to your question is, it is very rare to have a politician who votes the way he feels, who has no little voice in the back of his mind saying, what are they polling on this? And is a man who can earn the respect and affection and genuine affection of people who fundamentally disagree with him. You and I both know, all of us know, that there's one guy in the Senate whose name I won't mention, of whom it is said, a very smart guy, even his best friends can't stand him. There are a lot of politicians who survive on sheer willpower and tenacity, and they're smart, but boy, there is very cold steel in their eyes. Paul Wellstone was, in the Yiddish phrase, a mensch. He was a sweet, nice guy who had very strong beliefs, but he wasn't a hater. He wasn't a zealot. And I think that's why you're hearing this remarkable mourning from people who couldn't have agreed with him less.
And Candy, I am struck that, as you pointed out, it's not just Democrats, it's not just moderate Republicans, it's Republicans all the way on the right who were calling CNN today, making sure that we knew that they cared about this man and that they are going to miss him.
Sure, yeah, and he was, you know, the other thing, I mean, in talking about, is he so different from the other people up there? The thing about Paul Wellstone that made you really appreciate him as a journalist is he never stopped. I mean, the camera would go off and he would be on another subject that he was passionate about. He just, you know, he went on and on. I mean, that's what he liked to talk about in his private time. So he was, you know, he's also, as you know, that most of the time when you get a 15-second soundbite, it's about a half a sentence for most of the politicians. Paul Wellstone could get 12 ideas in 15 seconds. So, you know, he was great fun to cover.
All right, well spoken. Candy Crowley, our political correspondent, Jeff Greenfield, our senior analyst in New York. We thank you both. We appreciate it. Coming up on Newsnight, before we go back to that terrible sniper case, we're going to remember Paul Wellstone with two of his former colleagues, Senator Patty Murray and retired Senator Paul Simon. More now on Senator Paul Wellstone, who he was, the legacy he left, and what happens in the United States Senate. He was fighting a very closely fought campaign in the state of Minnesota. We'll talk to Senator Patty Murray, first of all. She's also chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. We'll also talk with a former senator, Paul Simon, of Illinois. Senator Murray, to you first. You and I talked a little bit earlier today. Have you seen anything quite like this? We've seen the tributes pouring in from Democrats, from Republicans. It's pretty remarkable.
Well, you know, Paul was so full of life, and he made everybody feel that they were important and that their voice was important. And I have seen him with individual people, empowering them, and I have seen him with crowds of 1,000, empowering the entire crowd to feel like they could make a difference. And I think that kind of life is hard to believe that it's gone. I think that's why it is just so difficult for all of us today.
Former Senator Paul Simon, I should have said you're joining us from Carbondale, Illinois, near your home in Illinois. You yourself, known as a liberal Democrat, Senator Wellstone was unabashedly, proudly a liberal Democrat. Is that a breed that we just don't see much of anymore? But before I ask you that, what about Senator Wellstone himself?
Well, he was one of the points that Jeff and others have made. He was fun to be with. Bob Dole mentioned that. But I think the two things that you really think about Paul Wellstone are, number one, his compassion, and number two, his courage. If there's one ingredient that government really needs, it's courage.
And the other part of that question, we don't hear, it's almost as if liberal has become a dirty word in American politics. Does it take more courage to be liberal?
Well, I think that many people who are liberal today don't use the tag, but if you ask them where they stand on health care for all Americans, they say we're for it. You know, go on the issues. And I think what some people call the liberal agenda actually is very much alive and still very much needed in the nation.
Senator Murray, as I mentioned, you're also the chair of the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and even as the state of Minnesota and the nation mourns the loss of Paul Wellstone with the election just barely 11 days away, surely we know that thought is being given to what happens in the state of Minnesota. Can you tell us about any discussions you've had or any discussions you're aware of in terms of what happens to his name on the ballot?
Well, I think all of us are really focused today on talking to Paul's staff, his family, the many, many people who support and love Paul, and to give him our condolences and our our thoughts and our prayers as we get through the next several days. And certainly we're very close to an election, and that's difficult for all of us to get over that hurdle and say, what do we do next? And that will be something that will have to occur in the next couple days, working with, of course, Paul's family in mind, as well as his supporters and the party in Minnesota.
We can certainly understand that, given the fact that it was just today that the senator's plane went down. Senator Simon, the name of Fritz Mondale has come up. The two of you served in the Senate together. Any thought on whether Fritz Mondale, the speculation has been perhaps the party might turn to Walter Mondale? Any thought about whether he'd be willing to do this?
I have no idea whether he'd be willing to do it or not, but he would be superb. He could move into the Senate and serve immediately, and certainly philosophically is of the same bent as Paul Wellstone.
All right, we want to thank both former Senator Paul Simon and Senator Patty Murray. Thank you both for talking with us this evening. It's good to see you both.
Thank you, Judy.
We appreciate it.
Thank you, Judy.
And one other person we want to talk with tonight, and that is a reporter who spent yesterday covering Paul Wellstone, traveling around the state as he campaigned in this tight Senate race. He is Alan Elsner. He's a national correspondent for Reuters. He told one of the Newsnight's staff, he said, quote, "I never do TV interviews, but I'm doing this tonight to honor the memory of a nice guy." Alan Elsner, thank you for being with us. Talk about Senator Wellstone yesterday. What did he do yesterday?
Well, it was a typical Wellstone day. It was this kind of joy of campaigning, as one of your previous guests mentioned. He was driving around. His first event was in Daddy-O's, which was a kind of cafe diner in Elk River. But they got there a little early, so he just dove into a Denny's and started shaking people's hands. And I was struck by the fact that, you know, nobody seemed that surprised to see the senior senator of their state kind of bobbing up in front of them. You know, everyone said, "Hi, Paul, how you doing? You know, you got my vote," or maybe not. But nobody said, "Oh, wow, it's Senator Wellstone." He just wasn't that kind of guy. Later, he went into a Barnes & Noble, completely unscripted, just, you know, off the cuff. Let's go in there, see who's hanging around. Talk to the people behind the coffee bar. Talk to the people picking books. You know, it was the same kind of thing. He seemed to have a one-on-one relationship with everyone in the state of Minnesota, as far as I could see.
He went into this campaign earlier this year. He was considered vulnerable, maybe the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent, and yet he fought his way to a place, I think, where a lot of people thought he had a good chance to hold on to the seat. What were his views when you talked to him yesterday about what his chances were?
Well, I think I was with him for about 5 or 6 hours, and a lot of it was off the record, but I think he was utterly convinced that he was going to win. He put his trust in his ground operation, his grassroots support that was spread all over the state, and which is what got him elected the first time 12 years ago. And I think that he was absolutely convinced he was going to win, but he was really looking forward to the last week and a half of the campaign. He kept saying how much fun it was going to be. And you know, there are a lot of politicians out there who just go through campaigning as a kind of chore. It's a drag. It's something you just got to do to get elected. But for Wellstone, it was just a blast. He was having fun.
And he was and being received well. Alan Elsner, one other thing, his career had been, he was a professor for 21 years at Carleton College in Minnesota. He went from teaching to politics. Was there anything of the professor in what you saw?
Well, you know, whenever I saw Paul Wellstone, I kind of left with a reading list. He'd always have a few books that, you know, you have to read this. You have to. Yesterday he told me I had to read this book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And there was another one that I can't remember. I wish I'd written it down. But he said it was like 1,200 pages long, and he forced everyone at Carleton to read it. And he said I should read that too. And another thing that came out yesterday, you know, it came out that my father and his father were born in the same town in Russia, in Odessa. And that seemed to let loose a whole set of memories about his father. His father was had wanted to be a writer and an essayist, and he'd almost made it. And I got the impression that Wellstone was kind of looking back a little bit, and he was also very concerned to tell me that he wanted to go to Jerusalem with his whole family. He had gone quite a long way away from organized Judaism. He certainly wasn't considered a prominent supporter of Israel, but he seemed concerned to tell me that there was still a Jewish heart beating in Paul Wellstone, and that was one of the things that I really took away from the day.
Alan Elsner, Reuters correspondent, who spent yesterday Paul Wellstone's last full day of campaigning. He spent the day with Senator Wellstone. Alan, thank you very much for talking with us.
You're very welcome.
We appreciate it. A little later on Newsnight, you'll hear some more about the early career of Paul Wellstone, but there was much more going on in the world today, and for that and more, let's go back to my colleague Anderson Cooper in New York. Anderson.
Judy, thanks very much. Coming up next, we're going to have a look at the sniper case. The legal process begins against 2 suspects. We also are following a breaking story out of Moscow right now. Reuters is reporting that Russian special forces have entered the theater, where as many as 700 people are being held hostage by several dozen heavily armed Chechen rebels. The Reuters report also says that armored personnel carriers are seen going toward the theater, as are ambulances. 5 hostages, or people who are believed to be hostages, were seen leaving the theater, but no other information at this time as to casualties or the status of both the hostages and the rebels. Special forces have apparently entered the theater. Gunshots have been heard, and that is the latest from Moscow. We will bring you up to date if warranted. We'll have more news coming right back. Finally from us, Paul Wellstone, as he might like to be remembered, the feisty campaigner. A look now at a campaign ad from back in 1990 that seems inspired by filmmaker Michael Moore and his hot pursuit of a GM executive in Roger and Me. Wellstone desperately seeking the incumbent at the time, the one he'd go on to beat in a surprise upset. Take a look.
When I decided to run for Senate, there was one thing I was looking forward to. So as it turns out, were a lot of you.
Well, I expect that there will be some debates.
I'd love to see you debate with him.
Well, I think there should be debates, yeah.
Some people have more money than others to play with, and where if you debate, you're kind of standing there without money.
Getting a hold of the person I had to debate, however, proved easier said than done.
Is Rudy Boschwitz here? No, he's not.
You don't want me to go in?
No, we don't like strangers walking around.
First, I tried his campaign headquarters.
Let me give you my home phone number, too, okay?
Sure. I'll make sure that he gets this, and we'll get back to you.
What do you think? Do you think we should have debates around the state? So that people can see
I'll get the message to him.
What do you think?
Glad to meet you.
No, but about these debates.
Thanks for coming down.
Okay,
Make sure he gets your message.
all
Thank
right,
you.
I'll see you all.
Nice car. Then I tried his office.
Is he here?
He is not here. He is returning from Milwaukee.
No luck.
I'll write my home phone, too.
Sure.
Is this your pen?
I'm not sure. Probably not.
Looks like a nice one. Well, I don't have a lot of money, so I'll keep this one for our campaign.
That will be fine.
I tried everything. I mean everything.
Rudy Boschwitz here.
No, not today.
Did Rudy Boschwitz call? Did anybody get a call from him? No. Well, if he calls, everybody, let me know. Hey, you guys?
Okay, well, maybe I can find him somewhere then. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
They say he's in the cities. I don't know where he is. He's not in Minneapolis. They say he's campaigning, and then I go to St. Paul. They say he's in Milwaukee.
Rest assured there will be debates on the key issues of this campaign. Look for upcoming dates and places. And in the meantime, if you see a silver-haired gentleman in a plaid shirt, mention I'm looking for him. Yes, information. Do you have the telephone number of a Rudy Boschwitz, please, in Plymouth?
Before we go, we want to update you on the